My brother fraudulently took all of our parents' inheritance. He thought I would keep quiet, but I gathered evidence, took him to court, and won every penny. Now he has nothing, and I have restored justice. Stay with us until the very end to find out how the story ends. We look forward to your comments and thoughts on the story. I have always believed that trust is the most important thing in a family. Michael and I were different. He was older, always confident, reserved, and a little distant. I was softer, trusting, with a love for details and family traditions. But even in the most difficult situations, I knew that he was my brother and would never hurt me. That's what I thought until our parents died. Dad passed away first, quickly, and almost without suffering. Heart. Mom held on for another 9 months. Michael and I spent those months together, taking care of her, taking turns staying with her, buying medicine, stroking her hands when she couldn't sleep. I felt like we had grown closer, that we had gone through this together. We buried her in March. It was cold, gray, and drizzling. After the funeral, Michael took care of everything: bills, documents, the house. He said he would take care of all the formalities, that my mother had left everything in order. I didn't doubt him. He was always the one who knew what to do. And I just trusted him. A month passed, then another. I didn't receive any documents, no calls from the notary or the bank. And then I accidentally found out that my parents' house had been sold. Its photo appeared on a real estate website. I called Michael. His voice was even irritated. "I took care of everything," he said. "You have nothing to worry about." "But why without me? The will," I stammered. He sighed. "There was no will. My mother transferred everything to me before she died. It's easier that way. You said yourself that you didn't want to deal with it." I didn't say that. I said I trusted him. That's not the same thing. I didn't sleep that night. I took my mother's old letters out of the drawer, her correspondence, anything that might shed some light on the situation. And the longer I looked into the past, the clearer it became to me that something was wrong. He was hiding something very important. And then I realized I couldn't keep quiet. Not this time. I remembered Mrs. Allison's law office from the time when my father was drawing up a power of attorney to sell his old truck. It was a small brick house with a heavy door and creaky floors. Inside, it smelled of dust, old paper, and mint candies, which the secretary always kept in a glass vase at the reception desk. I came without an appointment. I just couldn't wait any longer. Mrs. Allison, an elderly woman with silver streaks at her temples, looked at me intently over her glasses. "Sarah? William and Helen's daughter? How long has it been since I saw you?" I sat down opposite her, clasping my hands together. "My mother died a few months ago. My brother says there was no will, but I remember my mother telling me she wanted everything to be divided equally." She nodded and reached for the filing cabinets. "If it went through us, we'll find it. We're not allowed to throw anything away, even after all these years. Wait a moment." I sat watching her leaf through folders, pull out drawers, click locks. The world around me went deaf, as if the air had thickened. All I could hear was her breathing, the rustling of papers. And finally, her voice. "I've got it." My heart skipped a beat. "What is it?" "Your mother's will. It was drawn up 3 months before her death, signed and notarized. She really did divide everything equally between you and Michael." I didn't know what to say. It felt like something had broken inside me. "But how?" He said there wasn't one, and that she had signed everything over to him. Mrs. Allison frowned. "It says right here, 50% to you, 50% to him. The estate is divided according to the law. There were no rewrites. At least, not that we're aware of. He may have provided another document, but I would check its authenticity." I left the office, holding onto the railing as if it were my lifeline. It was betrayal. Cold-blooded, calculated. But now I had proof. The will. And I knew I wouldn't stop. I hesitated for a long time before calling him. Too much had been said in the past. Too much I had forgiven him in life, because we were family. But now everything was different. I couldn't pretend nothing had happened. I couldn't keep quiet anymore. I called in the evening. He answered with a slight note of irritation in his voice, as if I had invaded his personal space again. "Hi, Michael," I said calmly. "We need to talk." "About what?" "I thought we'd already discussed everything." "No," I paused. "I was at Mrs. Allison's." The silence on the other end lasted a second, maybe two, but I could feel him holding his breath. "And?" "The will exists, the real one, signed by Mom. She wanted everything to be divided equally. You knew that, Michael." He exhaled heavily. I imagined him clenching the phone, pacing from corner to corner. "Listen," he began. "This is all nonsense. Mom didn't know what she was doing in her last months. I just wanted to make things easier. You didn't want to get involved back then." "That doesn't give you the right to decide for me," I interrupted. "You lied. You hid the will. You violated our parents' last wishes." He fell silent. Then he said quietly, almost wearily, "It's too late now. The house is sold. The money is spent. What are you going to do now?" "Seek justice," I replied firmly. "The law still exists, Michael, and now I have something I didn't have before. Proof." "Are you serious? You're going to sue your own brother?" "Not as a brother, as a man who betrayed me." I hung up, feeling fear and determination mingling inside me. The conversation had not brought relief, but it had given me the most important thing, a clear understanding that I was no longer alone. The truth was on my side, and now it was up to me. I found Miss Winter's law firm through a recommendation from a neighbor. She was young, about 35, with a sharp gaze and the gait of someone who was used to winning cases. As soon as I entered the reception area, I knew I had come to the right place. Everything was strict, neat, and businesslike. "Are you sure the will exists?" she asked when I finished my story. "I saw it at the notary's office, certified, with signatures. Everything is official." She nodded and carefully placed her notebook on the table. "Then let's start with that. First, we'll request notarized confirmation of the will. Second, we'll make an official request to the registration chamber regarding the transfer of ownership. If your brother submitted fake documents, it will be obvious. What if he's already sold everything? The money's been spent, as he said." "Even in that case," she said calmly, "it is possible to seek compensation. If we can prove that the will was deliberately concealed and that you have suffered losses, we have a chance of recovering every last cent. It will take time. But we have a basis, and that's the main thing." I listened to her and felt the ice inside me melt. No one had ever spoken to me with such confidence before. No one had ever stood by me, reached out a hand, and here she was, hardly knowing me, already fighting for my truth. "Michael is not an easy man," I added after a pause. "He knows how to turn everything to his advantage, and he knows I'm alone. I have no children. My husband is dead. He's sure I can't stand up to him." Miss Winters smiled slightly. "Believe me, this isn't the first time someone has misjudged someone else's determination." She gave me a list of documents, explained what I needed to do, and even helped me draft an official letter for the notary. I left the office with my hands full, and with a sense of confidence in my heart for the first time in a long time. The letter arrived 3 weeks later. It was a thick envelope with a stamp, official letterhead, and the registration chamber logo in the upper corner. I held it in my hands as if it were something explosive. My heart was beating fast, my palms were sweaty. I sat down at the kitchen table, took a sip of cold coffee, and carefully tore open the envelope. Inside were 2 sheets of paper. The first confirmed that our parents' house had been transferred to Michael's name through a deed of gift signed just a month before my mother's death. The second indicated that there was indeed no will in the database. I immediately drove to Miss Winters. After listening to me, she frowned and began working on the documents I had brought from Mrs. Allison's office. We compared the dates. The will had been drawn up before the deed of gift, much earlier. The signatures didn't match. Even the handwriting style was different. My mother always wrote Ellen with one L, but the deed had two. "Do you think he forged the signature?" I asked, not believing my own voice. "I'm not saying anything yet," she replied calmly. "But we'll definitely have it checked out by a handwriting expert. And if it is a forgery, he's not just a dishonest brother, he's a criminal." My head was spinning. There was a buzzing in my ears, as if I were standing on a highway with my whole life rushing past me. How could he? It was our home, our mother, our memories. "He thought I wouldn't check," I whispered. "He thought I'd just disappear, like an old photo in a drawer." Miss Winters looked at me with the respect that strong women have for each other. "But you didn't disappear," she said. "You're fighting, and now he won't be able to hide behind paperwork." I stepped outside, clutching the folder with the evidence. The world hadn't changed. People hurried by, children laughed, cars honked. But I walked firmly on the asphalt, because now I had the truth. And the truth is a very loud voice, if you're not afraid to hear it. Handwriting analysis turned out to be not as easy as I thought. First, I had to get an official request through a lawyer, then collect samples of my mother's signatures, preferably from different years. I rummaged through old letters, receipts, and greeting cards. I found a note she had left me on the refrigerator 10 years ago. "I'll be back for dinner. Don't forget your medicine." There was her signature, so recognizable, light, with a loop on the letter E. It was completely different from the one on the deed, where the letters were squeezed together as if someone was trying to imitate her but didn't know how to hold her hand. I took everything to Miss Winters' office. She sent the materials to a forensic lab, and all we could do was wait. Those were the most nerve-wracking days of my life. I couldn't read, knit, or even watch TV. My thoughts were spinning in circles. What if everything matched? What if I was wrong? The answer came 2 weeks later. The letter was sealed, just like before. We opened it right there in the office, with Miss Winters present. She read aloud. "The handwriting on the presented deed of gift differs significantly from the samples provided for comparison. The likelihood that the document was signed by the person presented in the samples, Ellen Richardson, is extremely low." I felt as if a flood of light had been poured over me. I'm not crazy. I'm not nitpicking. Everything was really as I had felt in my gut. He had forged the will. He had broken the law. He had betrayed me. "This is a criminal case," Miss Winters said. "We can file a lawsuit. And believe me, with this evidence, the court won't just annul the agreement. It could hand down a conviction. Do you want to pursue this?" I looked out the window at the street where my parents once walked hand in hand. They wouldn't have wanted a war between their children, but they certainly wouldn't have wanted betrayal. "Yes," I replied. "I'll see this through. Not for revenge, for the truth, for them." The lawsuit was filed quickly. Miss Winters prepared everything like an experienced strategist before a battle. A well-written statement, a list of evidence, references to the law, copies of expert reports and notarized documents. I signed the papers with a trembling hand, but there was no fear in my voice anymore. Everything that was happening no longer seemed distant to me. Now I was part of the process, not as a victim, but as a woman who had decided to fight for the truth. And it was on that evening that the phone rang. The number wasn't saved, but I knew immediately who it was. "Hi." Michael's voice was hoarse. It's me." I was silent. I didn't need to hear his hello. I needed an explanation, or at least an attempt to admit his guilt. "I heard about the statement," he continued. "Do you really want to take this to court?" "I already have," I replied, "and not because I want to hurt you, because you deserve it." There was silence on the other end of the line. He was trying to find the right words, but he didn't seem to know how to start. "Listen," he began again. "I didn't want it to turn out this way. You know how hard it was back then. I thought you wouldn't argue. You were always so gentle." "And you took advantage of that," I interrupted him. "You thought I would keep quiet because we're family, but real families don't hide their mother's will. They don't forge signatures. They don't sell their family home. You realize that a court case will complicate everything? It won't bring Mom back." "No," I said quietly, "but it will restore justice and my self-respect." He didn't say goodbye. He just hung up, and I realized that he still wasn't sorry. He was just afraid, not of losing his sister. He had lost her long ago, but of losing face, money, comfort. But now I had the truth, the law, and strength. Because strength isn't about shouting. It's about standing your ground in silence, even when you're all alone. The courtroom wasn't what I had imagined. It was simple, almost austere. Beige walls, wooden benches, the smell of old paper and coffee from the vending machine at the entrance. People spoke quietly, some leafing through documents, others nervously fiddling with pens and folders. I sat on the edge, clutching my bag, which contained copies of the evidence, my mother's letter, and my notebook with notes. Miss Winters arrived a little later, confident and composed as always. Seeing me, she nodded. "Are you ready?" I just sighed. What did ready mean? Who could possibly be ready to sit across from their own brother, whom they had known since childhood, shared toys, pieces of cake, summer trips, and now shared a bench in the dock with? When he entered, I immediately felt as if everything around me had frozen for a second. Michael looked tired and haggard, but still confident. He didn't look around, just glanced quickly around the room and met my gaze. At that moment, I saw something like confusion in his eyes for the first time. He didn't expect me to look up. He didn't expect me to look straight at him, calm and confident. And perhaps he didn't expect it to be so official, so real. The judge entered, and we stood up. The minutes, the introductory part, the list of parties. It all sounded as if it wasn't about me, but every word was about me. About the house where I grew up. About my mother, who loved us all. About my brother, who decided that it was okay to cheat and forget. When the defense tried to claim that the will had never been found, Miss Winters placed a copy of my mother's letter and the expert report on the table. The judge took them, squinted, and leafed through them. "This will be considered," he said. Michael sat stiffly. He tried to keep a straight face, but I could see him flinch with every document, every piece of paper, every detail. And I realized the truth was beginning to speak louder than his words. After the first hearing, I couldn't sleep for a long time. The judge's words, Michael's expression, and Miss Winters's calm voice replayed over and over in my head. I felt as if I had just run the first mile of a marathon. There were still so many steps ahead of me, and each one required strength that I felt I had almost completely lost. I got up in the middle of the night, made some tea, and sat down by the window. In the silence, I remembered that I had kept the letters my mother had written to me when I left to go to college. There weren't many of them, but each line was like a voice from the past. I took the box out of the bottom drawer of the dresser and slowly sorted through the yellow envelopes. In one of them, dated November 1985, I came across a phrase that made me freeze. "If anything ever happens to me, know that everything I wrote in that green notebook remains true. This is my word. Take care of yourself, sweetheart." The green notebook. I remembered it. My mother often wrote notes in it, recipes, thoughts, sometimes poems. We called it Mom's Diary. It always lay in the drawer under the radio in her bedroom. After she died, I took it, but hardly ever opened it. It was too painful. Then I put it in a box on the top shelf of the closet. I jumped up, turned on the light, and climbed onto a chair. Dusty but intact, the diary was right where I had left it. I opened the first pages. Memories, descriptions of the garden, notes about the weather. But toward the end, there was a line written in capital letters. My will, for Jane only. My heart pounded. There, in my mother's clear handwriting, was a complete list of what she wanted to leave to whom. The house was mine. My grandfather's painting was for Michael. The sapphire earrings were for my daughter. Everything was written by hand, dated and signed. There was no notary, but it was sincere, with her soul. And perhaps that was enough to show the court what she really wanted. The next morning, I didn't wait. I wrapped my mother's notebook in a soft scarf and went to Miss Winter's office. She greeted me with the same calmness that always gave me confidence, even when I was trembling inside. "Do you have something for me?" she asked, seeing the look on my face. I unfolded the scarf and handed her the diary. Miss Winters carefully leafed through the pages, reading excerpts, jumping from one year to another until she came to the page I had marked with a bookmark. My last will and testament, for Jane only. She read the lines slowly, then put the diary down and looked at me intently. "This could be a very strong argument," she said. "Yes, it's not notarized, but if we can confirm that the handwriting is indeed your mother's, if we can establish the chronology of its creation, it will be a document expressing her last will and testament. And if the judge sees a logical, plausible, and consistent line of inheritance in it, he may well give it weight. And that's against the forgery my brother presented?" "Especially against it," she nodded. "The court often assesses not only the legal force, but also the good faith of the parties. Your brother concealed the existence of this diary. If the court finds that he deliberately concealed important evidence, it could work in our favor." I sat looking at the pages where my mother's handwriting was written in simple and honest words. Home is Jane. She grew up in it. It wasn't just a will, it was her voice, her last concern, her way of saying, I knew who I could trust with everything that was dear to me. "We'll submit this as evidence," said Miss Winters, "and we'll request an additional handwriting analysis. We have a chance." I nodded silently. For the first time in a long time, I felt truly calm. It was as if my mother was there again, as if she was looking down from heaven and saying, "You're not alone. I'll be with you until the end." The next hearing was completely different. This time I didn't feel panic, only focus. I arrived early, sat by the window, and waited. Miss Winters had a neat folder with photos of the diary pages and a statement requesting that they be added to the case file. We agreed that I would not interfere in the proceedings, just observe. On that day, it was the truth that spoke, not emotions. Michael arrived later than usual, accompanied by his new lawyer. His face was stubborn, his lips pressed together, and his gaze heavy. He stared at me immediately, but I did not look away. I was no longer afraid of him. I knew that I had not only the documents on my side, but also the truth. When the judge began the hearing, Miss Winters calmly and confidently handed over the diary. She told the judge about the letter, the entries, and how we had found it. She attached samples of my mother's handwriting from other letters and an expert opinion. Everything looked serious. But then Michael's lawyer stood up. "Your Honor, we argue that this diary cannot be recognized as a will. Moreover, there is a suspicion that it was created recently and forged by the plaintiff." The courtroom gasped. I tensed up, but Miss Winters remained calm. "Then, Your Honor, we would like to call a witness who saw this diary being written over the years." The judge nodded. The door opened, and a woman in her 70s entered the courtroom. She had gray hair neatly pulled back in a bun, a strict suit, and a familiar smile. "Mrs. Bryant," my lawyer introduced her. She was a friend of our mother's and worked with her in the library for 20 years. She saw Mrs. Carter writing in her diary on numerous occasions. She also remembers her referring to it as her personal will for Jane. The witness spoke calmly. confidently. She even remembered specific dates when my mother said, "I wrote down today who I want to leave things to, just in case something happens." Michael turned pale, and I sat there and felt my back straighten. Something inside me grew stronger. It was as if my mother had passed on another strength to me, through people who still remembered her as honest, kind, and genuine. After the hearing, I was about to leave the courthouse when someone called out to me softly. I turned around. Michael was standing a little way off, near a window that reflected the gray day. His face was tense, but without the former arrogance. He didn't approach, as if he himself didn't know why he had stopped me. I felt my throat tighten, but I approached him anyway, restrained, calm, as if I were a stranger. "Can we talk?" he asked, a little quieter than usual. I nodded, and we moved into an empty corridor where only the faint hum of the ventilation system could be heard. He stood with his eyes down, then looked up and said, "You don't want this to get to the press. You don't want us to be dragged through the courts for years." I looked at him silently. He avoided my direct reaction, talking as if to himself. "We can work something out. I'll give you half the house. I'll only take some of the money. No one will get hurt. It'll be quiet." Inside, I was boiling, but on the outside, I was completely calm. "You're offering to split something that doesn't belong to you?" He flinched. "It's just, the situation got out of hand. I didn't think you'd go this far. And I didn't think you'd go so far as to forge Mom's signature." He fell silent. A shadow flashed across his face, something like regret, but it quickly disappeared, giving way to irritation. "Just think about it, Jane. This is your chance to not ruin everything for good." I looked at him with unexpected compassion. Standing before me was not my brother, not the one I played with as a child, not the one who shared my parents' table. Standing before me was a frightened man driven by greed and now by fear. "It's already ruined, Michael, but I didn't start it." I turned and walked away. Ahead of me was the court, and the truth, and my mother, who I knew would be standing there. The hearing that day began in an unusual silence. None of those present said a word, as if they sensed that something important was about to happen. The judge sat down, placed copies of the documents in front of him, adjusted his glasses, and said, "Today, we will consider the possibility of recognizing Mrs. Carter's personal diary as her last will and testament." I held my breath. That recognition was the heart of the entire process. If the court agreed, everything Michael had planned would collapse. Miss Winters spoke first. She presented her mother's letter, the graphologist's report, and the witness testimony again, emphasizing that the style, language, and details in the diary left no doubt that it was a sincere, consistent document written by a person of sound mind. Michael's lawyer tried to protest. He said that the diary had not been officially certified and that the will should have been drawn up differently. But the judge dismissed this. The law allows a personal letter or document to be recognized as a last will and testament if it clearly expresses the intentions of the testator, especially if the opposing party cannot prove otherwise. Michael sat with his fists clenched. He didn't argue. He didn't interrupt. He didn't look at anyone. It was as if he wasn't there. His face turned ashen, and then, suddenly, he stood up, just like that, in the middle of the courtroom. The judge looked up in surprise. "Your Honor," Michael began, "I'm not going to continue this. I withdraw my claims." A deathly silence hung in the room. "Excuse me?" the judge asked. "Everything Jane said is true. I tried to cheat. Yes, I did. I thought she wouldn't go through with it, that I had everything under control, but she did, and I lost." He looked at me. "And you know, maybe you were always stronger." He sat down, not loudly, without fanfare, but it was a collapse, final and irrevocable. The judge sighed, nodded, and without looking up said, "The case is closed." When I left the courtroom, for the first time in a long time, I felt how easy it was to breathe. The air seemed brighter, cleaner, as if the sky above the city had opened up again. The sun broke through the clouds, and I stopped on the steps, closing my eyes, allowing myself this moment of silence, victory, and inner peace. Miss Winters was standing next to me. She didn't say anything. She just put her hand on my shoulder. Her silence said it all: respect, understanding, and even pride. I turned and looked at her, and we exchanged a light, genuine smile. Not a triumphant smile, a human one. Michael came out a little later. His steps were heavy. He walked with his head down, without his usual confidence. It seemed that he had surrendered not only to the court, but to himself. When he caught up with me, I suddenly realized that I felt no anger. There was no malice, only fatigue, and a burning, almost bitter sadness. "You won," he said quietly. "No," I replied calmly, "just the truth coming out." He nodded and walked away. I didn't stop him. I didn't call after him, because I knew there was now a gulf between us. And although I didn't hate him, it was impossible to go back to the way we were. Something died the moment he decided that the inheritance was more important than his sister. On the way to the parking lot, I passed a flower bed with white daisies, my mother's favorite. They grew here, at the steps of the courthouse, as if someone had planted them there on purpose. I bent down, touched the petals, and whispered, "I did it, Mom. I didn't back down." And then I walked on, not backward, but forward. The house that had been taken from me was now mine again. But most importantly, I didn't just get back the walls, I got back my voice, my inner strength, the strength to be myself and speak up when everyone around me expects silence. I put the key in the keyhole and froze. The last time I stood in front of this door was 6 months ago, when I didn't know it would be closed to me. Now it was opening again, but there was still a feeling of unfamiliarity in the air. I entered slowly. The house greeted me with silence. Everything was in its place. The old lamp in the corner, my parents' photo on the dresser, the familiar smell of wooden floors and time. But the feeling was different. It was as if I had returned not to my home, but to a museum of memories. Every object spoke to me, reminding me of how much had been lost before I could reclaim this space for myself. I walked through the rooms. Strangely, the kitchen was clean. Someone must have been there. Maybe Michael before his trial. But I didn't want to think about him. I poured myself a cup of tea and sat down at the table, where my mother used to bake pies, and my brother and I would argue about who could solve the crossword puzzle faster. I closed my eyes and imagined my mother sitting across from me. Her kind eyes, her wrinkles, her smile, and her voice. "You've always been strong, even when you didn't realize it." I smiled quietly. Later, I went upstairs. My parents' room, my childhood bedroom. Everything was untouched, but I felt that I needed to breathe new life into this house, not just return, but fill these walls with meaning again. I took out a notebook and wrote, "Let this house no longer be a place where resentment hides. It will become a place of strength, a place where you can breathe freely again." The next day, I called a repairman to repaint the walls and fix the wiring. I decided to replace the old sofa, not because it was bad, but because I wanted to let go of the past. That was the beginning of a new chapter. The house was mine again, not on paper, but in my heart. And I was myself again, only stronger. As I sat by the window with my morning cup of coffee, a thought crossed my mind. What if my story could help someone? Not for revenge, not for self-affirmation, just to remind people that silence is not peace. Sometimes justice begins with a single voice, with a single word. I opened my laptop, which had been gathering dust in a drawer for almost a year, and wrote a letter to the local newspaper. It was short but honest, about how one person decided that his desire was more important than someone else's will. How silence can turn into a chain if you don't find the strength to speak up. 2 days later, the editor replied. Her letter began with the words, "Thank you for deciding to speak up." Not only did they publish my text, but they also offered to create a small column called Letters of Truth. I agreed without hesitation. The first response came the morning after publication. An unfamiliar woman named Evelyn wrote that my story had given her the determination to talk to her son, who had been making decisions for her for years. Then there were more letters. Some shared their pain, others offered support. People started writing, not just to me, but to themselves. My house was filled with voices again, not voices from the past, but from the present, and I felt that I was not alone. I was not just a woman who had reclaimed her inheritance. I had become something bigger, a symbol that it is possible to stand up for yourself and remain kind. One day, I went to the post office and was stopped at the door by a neighbor. She was holding a newspaper and said excitedly, "Is that you? Jane, the one who wrote about this?" I nodded, a little embarrassed, and she suddenly hugged me. "I'm proud of you." I didn't expect that, but standing there in the warm sun, in the arms of a woman I barely knew, I realized that justice can be restored, and also that faith can be regained, not only in yourself, but in others as well. I found this letter in my mailbox on a normal Tuesday. The envelope was white, with no special markings, and the neat handwriting I recognized immediately, even though I hadn't seen it in years. Michael, my brother, I hesitated to open it for a long time. I just sat on the porch for a few minutes, holding the letter on my lap. My fingers were shaking. Two feelings fought inside me, caution and curiosity. The latter won out. He wrote simply, "No accusations, no tears, just facts, and between the lines, something resembling regret." He said he had left, that he now lived in a small house near the state border and had found a job at the local library, helping to sort books and organize the archives. He wrote that it wasn't a glamorous job, but it made him feel calm, that for the first time in a long time, he felt like no one was demanding anything from him. Then came the most important part. He wrote, "I'm not asking for your forgiveness, Jane. I don't deserve it. I just wanted you to know that I understand everything. I didn't just lose money, I lost you. And now I realize how precious that is." I reread those lines over and over again. They weren't an attempt to bring back the past. There was no request to meet, no manipulation, just a statement. He realized, and that was enough for me. I put the letter back in the envelope and held it in my hands for a long time. You know, it's a strange feeling when the pain starts to subside, not because it's been drowned out, but because it's finally been heard. I didn't know if I would reply. Maybe in time, maybe never. But I felt myself becoming calmer, deeper, purer. That evening, I wrote another column, not about the court, not about resentment, but about how important it is to be able to walk away and not cling to a past that has long since ceased to be home. Sometimes forgiveness is not a dialogue, it is freedom within oneself. I was just about to go shopping when the phone rang. The female voice on the other end introduced herself as the editor of a major magazine. She had been reading my columns, following my publications, and now she was calling with an offer, not just to write another article, but to become a regular contributor to a section on the rights of older people. "You write with warmth, but with conviction," she said. "And you're not afraid to talk about what others hide. That's important." I was silent, clutching the phone. Me? An author? A regular column? All my life I had only spoken within my family, in the kitchen, in whispers. And now someone thought my voice could be heard louder. By others. By the world. I didn't agree right away. I thought about it for several days, remembering how it all began, how difficult it was for me to simply believe in myself. But then I looked in the mirror, and saw not just a woman who had reclaimed her inheritance, but a woman who had survived betrayal, loneliness, and fear, and still remained herself. I agreed. I simply titled my first column, "When Silence Becomes Heavy." In it, I didn't talk about the trial or my brother, but about fear. The fear that paralyzes so many. The fear of saying, "I'm hurting. It wasn't right. I want to be heard." The letters poured in again. People wrote from all over the country. Women, men, even teenagers. Some thanked me. Some shared their stories. Some admitted that they had decided to talk to their families for the first time. I realized that my restoration of justice was not the end, but the beginning. I didn't just get my house back. I got my life back. My neighbors began to greet me with great respect. Elderly Mrs. Hardy once came up to me at the mailbox and said, "You know, I always thought that justice was a word for movies, but you showed me that it can be real." I smiled and thought, maybe one day even my brother will feel it, and maybe someday someone else will find the strength to seek the truth. Because now I'm not just Jane. I'm their voice, their example, their support. Several months have passed since my first column appeared in the magazine. Life seemed measured, almost peaceful. I wrote in the mornings, walked along familiar streets in the afternoons, and returned to my renovated home in the evenings. It seemed that everything had fallen into place. But the past, as promised, continued to remind me of itself. Not bitterly, not intrusively, but tangibly. Sometimes I caught myself reflexively looking at the inheritance departments when passing by banks. Or, while cleaning the attic, I avoided boxes with documents, even though I knew there was no longer any reason to be afraid. Everything was over. But the memory of that time when I felt helpless still lives on. One evening, I went to a local cafe where my brother and I used to have dinner with our parents. The menu hadn't changed. The same homemade casserole, the same fragrant cinnamon buns. I sat down at our old table by the window. A family was sitting at the next table. Young parents and their daughter. They were laughing, arguing about who would pay, sharing pieces of dessert. I looked at them and suddenly felt a strange, slight sadness. Not envy, no, just regret for what could never be. Our family was no longer the same. My mom and dad were gone, and my brother and I were separated not by miles, but by the choices he made. But then I remembered. I chose myself. I chose honesty, and if I had to pay for it with loneliness, I don't regret it. Because now I am not a victim, not a weak woman, not a sister who can be deceived. I am someone who was able to say no and live with the consequences. As I was leaving the cafe, the owner, an elderly Mrs. Brown, waved at me. "Jane, you've changed. You're glowing. And I'm happy for you." I smiled back at her. Because yes, I really had changed. Not bitter, not vengeful, just strong. And that strength comes from knowing that you didn't give up. When the phone rang from the local TV station, I almost dropped my cup of tea. A young man with a cheerful voice introduced himself as the producer of a morning show and said they would like to invite me on the air to tell my story and inspire viewers. I almost laughed. Inspire? Me, an ordinary woman from a quiet suburb? He explained that his team had been following my column for a long time, and they were sure that if even one person who heard me decided to stand up for themselves, then the broadcast would be worthwhile. I sighed and agreed. Not out of vanity. I just felt that this was a new step, and perhaps the boldest one yet. The day of the broadcast came quickly. I arrived at the studio in a modest light jacket, my hair pulled back, my hands shaking. In the dressing room, a woman with an earpiece smiled at me. "Don't worry, just be yourself. That's why you were invited." Everything in the studio was sparkling with light. The cameras, the hosts, the hustle and bustle. It was all foreign to me. And yet, when the music started and the announcer said, And now we have a woman with us who has proven that justice can be restored. I stepped forward without hesitation. I spoke calmly, simply, about how I was left alone, how my brother decided he had the right to control our family's destiny, how I didn't immediately find the strength to resist, how long I remained silent, and how one day I stopped. The studio was quiet. Even the host, who had been lively and quick at the beginning, froze as she listened to me. And then there was applause, small but sincere, and I felt my heart fill up. I wasn't a hero, but I was truthful, and the truth, as it turned out, can also be loud. After the broadcast, hundreds of people wrote to me, some with gratitude, others with questions, and some with simple words. I understand you. I read every letter, and I felt that I had done everything right. The letter arrived on a spring morning. The day was bright, with the faint scent of lilacs from the neighboring garden. The envelope was familiar, with the same neat handwriting. From Michael. I held it in my hands a little longer than usual. For some reason, I didn't want to rush. I wasn't expecting anything. No explanations, no apologies. I had let go. But still, my heart responded. Inside were just a few lines. No date, no return address. Jane, I saw you on TV. You've become the person you always were. Only now the whole world knows it. I'm not asking you to come back into my life. I just wanted you to know that you were right. I loved you very much. And in my own way, I probably always will. Michael. I read it 3 times. No tears, no pain. Just that strange calm that comes when everything falls into place. He didn't ask for forgiveness, but he understood. And he said it. For me, that was enough. I didn't hold a grudge. Not for a long time. I folded the letter and put it in a box where I kept important papers. Not because I wanted to go back to him, but because those lines marked the end of a whole chapter of my life. That same day, I drove to my parents' house. I stood at the gate, looked at the old porch, and remembered how Michael and I used to run barefoot on the lawn, how my mother called us in for dinner, how my father read the newspaper in his rocking chair. Everything was so far away, but also so close. And for the first time in a long time, I felt not loss, but gratitude. For everything that had been, and for being able to walk this path. Before I left, I whispered into the emptiness, I forgive you, Michael. And it was as if something invisible had fallen from my shoulders, light as pollen. Freedom. My old friend Carol and I were sitting in a cafe by the park, just like we used to 15 years ago. She looked at me and smiled, shaking her head slightly. You have no idea how many women you've inspired. Now they whisper in lines, have you heard about the woman who sued her brother for every penny he had? I laughed and waved it off, but inside I knew it was true. My voice grew louder. People recognized me, wrote to me, invited me to speak. But I found myself thinking more and more. What next? I didn't want to go back to my old life of quiet submission. I had changed. I could no longer remain silent when I saw others suffering from injustice, as I once had. And then one day, waking up in the middle of the night, I realized I needed to start a foundation, a small one, for women who had faced family deception, legal pressure, and betrayal by their loved ones. Not just advice, not just a column, real help. I gathered the documents and made everything official. I named it simply Jane's Voice, because it is our voice that we most often lose in such situations, and I got mine back. The first meeting took place in the library. Only 6 people came, women of different ages, with slumped shoulders and distrust in their eyes. But by the end of the evening, they were sharing their stories, listening to each other, taking leaflets, and asking, when is the next meeting? I went home and lay in silence, staring at the ceiling for a long time, and I thought, I did everything right. My home is no longer just walls. It is a place of strength, a place where I write, where I meet those who are looking for support, where I am no longer afraid, and where I am finally myself. I don't know where Michael is now. Maybe he moved, maybe he lives alone, but I know I don't hold a grudge against him, because after going through everything, I found myself. I returned there many years later. I hadn't planned to. I just happened to be nearby and suddenly realized I was ready. My parents' house was still standing, only the paint on the gate was peeling, and the garden seemed smaller. Or maybe I had grown. I walked along the path where Michael and I used to race to see who could get to the porch first. I breathed in the familiar scent of jasmine, the same one my mother used to plant in the corner by the kitchen window, and I closed my eyes. Memories didn't come rushing back. They came gently, like old friends. There was my mother laughing on the porch, my father adjusting his hat, my brother and I arguing over who would get the last bun. It was all there, and it was all still with me. No longer painful, but history. My history. I stood there for a while, not going inside. Other people lived in the house now. I didn't want to disturb them. I just wanted to say goodbye. Not to the place, to the person I used to be. To the Jane who was afraid, silent, shy, and submissive. I saw her off with gratitude, because in the end, she was the one who found the courage not to give up. When I returned home, to my house, where now the laughter of my grandchildren rang out and the smell of fresh bread filled the air, I stopped by the fireplace. There was a photograph of my mother and me on a picnic, a sunny day, looking into each other's eyes, smiling. I took the picture in my hands and said, "I did it, Mom." Everything was just as you taught me, truthfully and with dignity. In the evening I went outside, sat down on a bench by the porch, and looked up at the stars. The sky was calm. It was as if even it knew that the circle was complete. I wasn't seeking revenge. I was seeking justice. And I found it. I didn't destroy. I rebuilt. Myself. My life. My truth. And now, when someone asks, "How did you get through it?" I'll answer, "I just went all the way." Because that's what matters. And I'm alive. Real.